Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are most welcome to Bradford Cathedral for this really very special moment. This is our centenary year, and throughout the year we have been having some really interesting opportunities to reflect on various aspects of our life together, and tonight is no exception. This is a conversation between faiths, how the role of faith in Bradford leads to a stronger city, and what it can offer in the public square across the United Kingdom. And if this is your first time here in Bradford Cathedral, you are very welcome indeed. For all Bradfordians, this is your cathedral. So I just invite you to feel at home here this evening for the next 75 or 90 minutes. I want to say thank you on a couple of things to start with. First, I'd like to say thank you to those who have provided the refreshments for this evening. Maybe we could show our appreciation for them. And I'd like to thank you for those who signed up on Eventbrite for this, because it does give us a feel for how many people are coming. And it's really helpful. So there are other events that we have coming this year, so do use Eventbrite to sign up for those, please. We also have issued some cards, some little white cards, which you will have on your chairs. And these tell us if you're able or want to fill it in. It's a really helpful response for us, because it helps us to find out how you're hearing about events such as this. Now, tonight's event is being recorded, and so we are aiming to put this out on our website. So if you've got any friends who wanted to come but can't make it, they're going to be able to listen to it after this evening. The way we're going to run this evening is like this. First of all, our three guests are going to be invited to give a 10-minute presentation. Carrie and Bishop Toby are going to be giving 10 minutes on the way that their individual faiths inform the way they see their engagement with their particular context here in West Yorkshire. And then Michael Barnes will be giving a wider picture about faith and the public square in the United Kingdom, and some of the influences that there are around that conversation. So 10 minutes each on that. Then they're going to engage with each other, with me making sure that everyone gets a fair crack of the whip in conversation coming out of those presentations. And then there'll be an opportunity for some questions from the floor as well as we draw the evening to a close. So I really hope that it's going to be a very stimulating and interesting hour and a half. And let me introduce you to the panel this evening. Imam Kari Asim is the head imam at the Makkah Mosque in Leeds. He is the deputy chair of the government's anti-Muslim hatred working group, and he is the chair of the Mosques and Imams National Advisory Board. Bishop Toby, who will be known to many of you, has been Bishop of Bradford since 2014, and prior to that he was the Archbishop of Canterbury's Secretary for Inter-Religious Affairs. And Professor Michael Barnes has taught for many years at Heathrop College in the University of London, and now teaches inter-religious relations at Roehampton University, and is research associate at the School of Advanced Study in London University. Would you please welcome your panel? So I'm going to invite Kari Asim to kick us off, please, and he will be giving the first presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's evening. The sun's shining. for Muslims, the evening really starts when it's like 10 o'clock when the sun's set. So that's why, So I'm really honored and esteemed, privileged to be here standing and sharing the platform with such esteemed panelists. And I'm really thankful to Reverend Jerry and Bradford Cathedral to be hosting this really important conversation between faiths. I'm going to talk about my vision for Muslims and how that vision is informed, and then the contribution that Muslims make to our cities in Leeds and Bradford town, and in Yorkshire, other towns. And then finally, the challenges and risks that we face as faith communities, in particular British Muslims. So in order to talk about my vision for British Muslims in Yorkshire, perhaps we reflect on that fact for a moment, that Islam is pretty much in the limelight all the time. Just as I was driving to here, I was flicking through the news and I came across a news where one of the candidates for Prime Minister's job actually mentioned that, a memo's been leaked that he allegedly said that Islam has put Muslims back centuries. And that is where I'm going to start off. That effectively, my vision is twofold. One is that perception about Muslims and the negativity that we find about Muslims, or this narrative of them and us, how can it be tackled? And just to give you a flavor of that, there are headlines that talk about Muslims tell us how to run our schools. So those Muslims tell us how to run our schools. Or headlines saying, BBC puts Muslims before you. So there's already this them and us narrative that's developed. And that's not just the news. Populist leaders talk about Muslims being aliens, or the fifth column. Then sometimes stories are made up, like the Rochdale Council announcing Muslims-only toilets in Rochdale, and things like that, which might make you laugh, but these are lived realities. So my vision is that somehow we tackle this perception about Muslims on the one side of the coin, and the other is the Muslims really owning that narrative. Muslims feeling a sense of belonging to their city, whether it be Leeds, Bradford, Yorkshire, or Britain. And that means that Muslims in Britain have to accept what British reality is. If there are injustices, failures, tensions, certain kinds of perceptions about a particular community, Muslims too must own those narratives. Own them in the sense that Muslims have responsibility to act responsibly vis-a-vis the reality. In other words, Muslims cannot be in Yorkshire or Britain and have all of their energies and faculties located elsewhere, whether it be in Pakistan, India, Somalia, or else, and somewhere else. This means that Muslims must take responsibility for any failures in society and partake in the rights that Britain offers. Muslims are not simply takers, but also contributors, because they accept responsibility for their society. And this twofold vision is interlinked. You might argue, potentially some might argue, that because perhaps Muslims do not contribute or are not seen to contribute as much to their neighborhoods, to their society, and as a result, this perception of them being outsiders is reinforced by the media or populist leaders. On the other hand, some Muslims argue that because the way the media treats them or the populist leaders treat them, their sense of equal citizenship or equal opportunities is not reinforced. And so the basis of this vision is very much what Islam says. Islam talks about the primary sources, like the Quran talks about that, O mankind, we created you from a single pair of a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes that you might get to know one another. The narration from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, says the believer is one who is sociable with others, and there is no good in the person who is not socially integrated. So effectively, there are primary sources that talk about Muslims being integrated into society. And when Prophet Muhammad migrated from his homeland to this new city, Medina, he established this concept of one nation. And because he was a migrant himself, his followers were migrant in that city, he could have set up an exclusive society, an exclusivist community, or a segregated community, but he very much founded this concept of Muslims having to integrate and be an integral part of the society in which they live in. And as a result, we've seen over the centuries, we can't argue that it's always been perfect, but there are numerous examples of this integration because this is part and parcel of our faith. And as a result, we see the Muslims in Yorkshire contributing in different ways. And there are patterns emerging that in some cases, that contribution is much more profound, whereas in other cases, it's only just started. And hopefully, in the next 5 to 10 years, we will see a very profound contribution in those areas as well. So take the example of politics. We have 2 MPs who are from the Muslim faith, who represent the constituents from Bradford. We have hundreds of councillors around the country. So the political participation in the political sphere is much more established and goes back a long way. But perhaps in other areas, like social areas, the health-related areas, that contribution is not as established as it could be. So there are examples of things happening in terms of Bradford Literature Festival, a true example of Muslims owning the narrative, celebrating the art and the literature contribution to our society and bringing communities together to celebrate that. There are other examples of whether it be the kitchen soup, whether it be the curry circle, or feeding the homeless. This is where effectively we as Muslims feel confident to contribute to that, our resources, our energies. But then, my vision is that we should be at the table about mental health issues, about domestic violence issues, about climate change issues, all the issues that affect our social mobility, our society, and we're seeing contribution happening, but this is where our focus as leadership, our focus is at the moment and where we would like to be. But there are also challenges. And as I mentioned early on, that owning that narrative means that we also need to tackle those challenges and those risks. And those risks vary from, on the one hand, to extremism, to other taboo issues that we might have in our society. Now, extremism is not a monopoly of a particular community, and persecution is not a monopoly of a particular community. But we, as Muslims, have some responsibility to not only just condemn extremism, but also try to see how we can have the mechanisms in place to go beyond condemning extremism, to be part of that narrative where, whether it be the Islamist extremism or far-right extremism, that we are together tackling the narrative, but also putting mechanisms in place so that atrocities do not happen in our country, in our society. Other issues could be tackling the brotherism in politics, that we've seen in Bradford, and things are improving and things have improved. But these are some of the issues that would need to be considered and also tackled when we are talking about the contribution that Muslim faith can play in a society. Finally, I'd like to just talk about some of the challenges that are linked back to the issue of what role can faith play, in particular Islam can play in society and making a healthy society. Hope Not Hate's report that will be released tomorrow shows that people continue to see Muslims overwhelmingly more negatively than any other religious groups. 31% of the population believes that Islam poses a threat to the British way of life. Now that is a challenge that cannot be tackled by Muslims alone. That is something that needs, perhaps religious literacy needs to be improved, perhaps reaching out to the other needs to take place, perhaps we all need to come out of our comfort zones and talk about the real issues that affect our society. Because Brexit has shown that our society is more fragmented than perhaps any one of us would like it to be. And how does the healing process take place? And to give you an example, just on Friday, a Thomas Cook flight from Turkey to Gatwick, 2 of the ladies had to be asked to leave because they saw 3 men wearing white sheets whilst on board, and they thought that these men were terrorists. Now, some of you might know that Muslims wear those white sheets when they go on pilgrimage, and potentially these pilgrims were coming back from Saudi Arabia via Turkey. Now, there's a real sense of fear, but at the same time, there's also religious illiteracy that's prevalent in our society, and it goes all the way, in our institutions everywhere else as well. And so, but at the same time, there is hope. And I'm going to leave you with that hope in the sense that Sunday was a marvelous day for many reasons. But one of the key reasons was that we won the World Cup, Cricket World Cup. Yeah. Really, a nail-biting match, but it was fantastic. But then the skipper, the captain, Morgan, mentioned that he thought that, when he was asked, whether the look of an Irishman had taken and had played his part, he said, we had Allah with us as well. Now that's quite provocative, and as a result, we've seen actually some members of the extremist groups have really lashed onto this phrase. But that really showed in terms of how, and actually I would like to read out the quote from the cricket captain. He said, "I spoke to Adil Rashid who's from Bradford, and he said, Allah is definitely with us. It's the rub of the green. It's also reflective of our team. We are a diverse side, and we brought that together today, said the captain. So effectively, leaving you with that thought that Allah or Islam does have a space in this society, and it's our responsibility, Muslims as well as everyone else, and people of faith and no faith, to come together to see how can we make our society a much more vibrant, dynamic, cohesive, where we are not afraid of each other, where we are not, feeling this sense of insecurity, which unfortunately leads to people not being as integrated as we would like our society to be. Thank you.
Bishop Toby, I think we're on with you now, please.
Great to be with you, and thanks, Dean Jerry, very much for your invitation. I think it's a real joy to be here together and to have this conversation, as Carrie said. Thank you, Michael, for coming all the way up here. He's one of my he's kind of the granddaddy of interfaith dialogue, really. I mean, I'm sorry about that, but you are a bit. You sort of, those of us who kind of came in your wake a little bit sort of look up to you as somebody who really was pioneering for a long, long time when it was not fashionable, really, and have made a way for others of us, and Carrie as well. Carrie and I sit on the as trustees of the Christian Muslim Forum, and I know the kind of flack that Carrie has got for some of the things he says very bravely, and I'm really grateful for your collegiality in many ways. My presupposition here, in a sense, in all that I say, is that the presence of people of different religious backgrounds, different faiths in Bradford is a gift from God. Just want to kind of begin with that. I think that's really important to state. It's not just, and I don't just say that personally, I look out and I see friends of different religious backgrounds for whom I'm grateful as a gift from God, but actually the presence of people from another faith is also, I think, a gift of God, because it enables us to see one another in a different way, and to see ourselves in a different way. I can't remember who it was who said, I don't know who discovered water, but it sure wasn't a fish. It's really helpful if we can see ourselves through other people's eyes. And somebody who has a different faith is able to touch us in a different way. And we've had some quite helpful conversations around that as well. I just want to look at two roots, if you like, two bits of Christian theology which inform the way that I would see my faith, the Christian faith, working out in this city and more widely, and how they underpin a vision for our society. And the first is very basic, very obvious, if you like, that as a Christian I believe that all people are made in the image of God, which means that we are all equally valued, and not just valued, but all reflect something of the nature of God. And that means that we all have something, as it were, to bring to the party. Everybody has a gift, has experience, has something that they bring, that they can contribute, which I think is really important in a culture in which agency sometimes for various people in our city has been marginalized. Many people are seen to be sort of recipients or victims or whatever. But this idea that we are created in God's image gives us agency and gives us value. I think in Christian theology, that's there in Genesis in terms of our creation, but it's also there when we see Jesus, who Christians believe is the human face of God. We see the way that Jesus engaged with all sorts of different people, including people who other people thought he shouldn't engage with, whether that was across gender or ethnicity or economic background. In all sorts of ways, Jesus broke those barriers and said, God is interested in everybody. And then the church has developed this, particularly in the writings of the Apostle Paul, in terms of this concept of the body of Christ, where everybody has something to contribute to the body of Christ, the church, which is in some ways, as Christians see it, a kind of a laboratory for the new world that God wants to bring in. And again, everybody has a contribution. Everybody has something to give. And I think that's really important in a place like Bradford, because I think it gives a proper confidence for Christians to be talking about our faith as something which has a really important message in a culture, in a situation where a lot of people are rubbished and pushed out. It's the kind of theology that sits behind the hospice movement. We've got a wonderful hospice here. And I'm not saying that all hospices are Christian, but the origins, the roots of the hospice movement come absolutely from that conviction that just because you're dying and you don't have economic worth, as it were, does not mean that we should not give the absolute best quality and care and service to people who are in the last few days or weeks or months of their lives. And that for me is as an example of the way that I think Christians need to be confident in terms of what we offer into the public space from Christian theology. At the same time, there's the other route, obviously, which is that Christians believe from a biblical perspective that we are all broken. We are all fundamentally flawed and broken as human beings. Jesus said, I didn't come to call those who were good and fine and don't have need of a doctor. I came to call those who are broken and to call sinners, he said, to repentance. So there's this kind of double-sidedness of Christian theology, which also has an impact on the public sphere, the public realm. We have something to offer, but we have to do it humbly because we know that we are all broken. I remember having a wonderful conversation with friends from the Council for Mosques, who every year put on a Christmas party for all sorts of people around the place in the Kidmat Centre, just not very far from here, on the other side of the city. And we were talking about, I had to cook the halal turkey and bring it along, and it was about who was serving and when we serve, and do the servers serve first and then eat afterwards? And we ended up thinking, no, we all ought to be serving and we all ought to be recipients of that service, because we all have something to give, but we are all broken as well. And therefore, we can't have the kind of us and them narrative that you were talking about, which is so prevalent today, because we are all us and we're all them. We're all the good guys, we're all the bad guys. There was the wonderful story of the Good Samaritan that was read in many of our churches yesterday as the standard reading, is a reading which is deliberately designed to undermine that sense of us and them. And there's a lovely biblical roots for that. The prophet Jonah, this great prophet, was really grumpy and ran away from God and really wanted God to destroy the enemies. And all the other people in that story, whether they were sailors who didn't really have much faith at all, who didn't want to throw Jonah over the side, they were all far more responsive to God than the prophet was. And that's a very good reminder for the church, I think. And Jesus, his disciples, lovely, wonderful people, but constantly getting it wrong and constantly showing us that we have to be humble in the offer that we bring. And there's a wonderful theme right through the Bible in those terms. So in terms of my vision for the city, it would be, well, in some ways it's the cricket. I mean, there was did you see that wonderful moment where the two Muslims on the cricket team, I've never seen them run so fast, even on the pitch, when the champagne came out. They were off so quick. But wasn't that a lovely moment? You know, absolutely part of the team, but very clear what their faith allowed them and didn't allow them to do. And room for them, and nobody tutting them or scolding them for doing that. And them not judging the people who were spraying champagne otherwise around either, but like, I don't really want it on me, thanks. And for us to find a way of, in good humor, accommodating one another, celebrating the gifts that we all have to bring, and making room for one another in those ways is important as well. Or I think, a bit closer to home of here, not that far away, a wonderful church where I sometimes go midweek of a lunchtime, and there's an extraordinary mix of people there. So it's a church, but it has a number of Muslim women who come regularly and who do cooking there and a bit of English and have a wonderful kind of fellowship there. And some other people, particularly a group of younger men from a Muslim background who've become Christians, Iranians, who are asylum seekers or who've got status. And they're all together in the kitchen. And the first time I got there, I asked, are there any arguments? Yeah, yes, I was told, loads of arguments, but it's about how long you cook the chicken. You know, and you go there and sit round the table and see those friendships, which are operating in all sorts of ways and all sorts of levels with serious complexities and serious differences of opinion and serious differences of background, and yet it works. And that, for me, is a picture of heaven, and that, for me, is a picture of what I would love to see Bradford more and more become.
Thank you very much indeed, Bishop Toby. So we move to our third presentation from Professor Michael Barnes. Michael, we're with you.
And now it's time for Grandpa. Apparently. Actually, I do remember meeting you, Toby, years ago in Hyderabad. Yes. Do you remember that? I do. You haven't changed at all. It was many years ago. You know you're getting old when the bishops start looking very young. I'm going to share with you a couple of convictions, that's all. One at the beginning and one at the end. The first of my convictions is that our religions are not so much different sets of beliefs, though they are that, of course. I like to think of our religions as schools, centers of teaching and learning, where an ancient wisdom is forever engaging with contemporary questions. Until quite recently, I was teaching at one such school. It's the Muslim College in London, where I rejoiced my self-appointed title of the lecturer in Catholicism at the Muslim College. I loved it. The great Zaki Badawi insisted that imams in the UK needed to understand the contemporary religious landscape. And the different dimensions of that landscape, he used to say, should be taught by local practitioners. That was me. I lived not far away. I was very much immersed in the multi-religious reality of West London. It was an enormous privilege to go to that place every year to map out my own faith for men and women who were studying Islamic traditions, but were also, for the most part, interested in the ever-shifting social context in which they lived. The men I always found pretty combative. The women always seemed to me to be better listeners, but they had also some very gently probing questions. We had some good discussions, and I remember one on just war theory, for example, on the eve of the Gulf War. Very, very sharp observations all around the room. It was a wonderful occasion. Sad, of course, to think of what it was that provoked it. How successful I was at explaining the intricacies of Catholic theology, I don't know, nor does it really matter. If I did nothing else, it was to intensify their sense of the complexity of the context within which any religious faith has to be practiced. Now, I don't have a message as such for this evening. I've a question, and it's the same question which I used to raise every year at the Muslim College. Something all persons of faith share. We want to be at home. We want to be safe. We want to be secure. Yet we also want to move away from home, to explore, to sample things that are different, even perhaps a little dangerous. And all of us have to find ways to deal with that tension within ourselves. How can persons of faith, Muslims and Christians, other people of faith, how can we find integrity in our prayer and our practice that doesn't ignore the surrounding context but actively responds to it? To put it more simply, how to be at home when engaging with what is other. How to be at home when engaging with what is other. The reason why we are here now is because we're taking my question seriously. This cathedral is home to the Anglican community. But for an evening, thanks to an act of gracious hospitality, it's become home, a safe place for all of us. We are creating, temporarily it is true, a microcosm of civil society, where we listen attentively and imagine a different set of relations. But if any such model of civil society is to work, it depends upon two things: on maintaining that integrity which marks our faith, which enables us to look back to the deepest sources of our inspiration, that on the one hand, and on the other, the generosity with which we somehow invite others to share the religious world that an ancient wisdom creates. We look, in other words, in two directions: to our own communities, who give us our sense of identity, and outward to other communities with which we are obliged to communicate. Now, obliged, that word. Am I not being a little bit prescriptive here? In a culture where so many people claim to be religious from choice rather than inheritance, is not faith a private affair? If people must be religious, is it not more appropriate that they stay locked into their own community enclave? What business is it of theirs to intrude beyond the boundaries, whether into another person's faith or into the secular world? If you have a faith, keep it to yourself. Now, no doubt there are times when we all feel life would be a lot easier if we just kept it to ourselves, if we just focused on faithful practice and forgot about the other elsewhere. But, of course, it's already been said, in an intrinsically pluralist, globalized, multicultural world, faithful practice can never be a purely private, personal concern. For a start, what I believe is always constrained by the world around me, by different accounts of what it means to be human. not to say by the suspicions and prejudices that sometimes make civil society seem very uncivil. Even if my priority is a matter of carving out a space where home provides security, some measure of engagement with the diversity that surrounds me is going to be necessary. The challenge is whether I can be positive about that interaction. To revert to that earlier image with which I started, the community of faith as a school, a center of teaching and learning, I would want to argue that the tradition of faith is to be viewed not just as ancient wisdom to be cherished, but as a gift to be shared with the wider community for the sake of the common good. Now, I'm hoping that this evening our conversation will enable us to be practical about how this is to be done. Meanwhile, let me just conclude, tie these little thoughts together with 3 little points, with apologies if they appear at this point a little bit abstract. Firstly, a word about difference or otherness. That persons of faith have different ways of configuring faith is obvious. But the guarding of difference, the guarding of home, that specificity of faith which confers a particular identity, that in itself is not a problem. The problem arises when a naturally conservative, inward-looking mindset, that's part and parcel of all our faith traditions. The problem comes when that inward-looking mindset, its home element, you might say, is turned outward in a way which demonizes some threat to home. And I think we're all aware of how that can happen. The root of all conflicts is not difference as such. It's competition. A rivalry between persons, we know that. Between countries, we know that. And cultures. A rivalry for attention, for respect, for esteem, as well as for the ordinary things which enable a society to function. Space, as much as anything. If that is correct, then attention needs to be paid to the conditions in the wider public space which create that mood, that negative mood of competition. The enemy, to put it rather crudely, often turns out to be not within this or that community. I think this is a very important little point. The enemy often turns out to be not within this or that community, let's get out of that sort of thinking, but in the between that we share. In the between that we share. Secondly, a word about social cohesion and the common good. Somehow we need to make a distinction between a top-down, state-driven approach which expects religious communities to bury differences. Difference is a bad thing, in other words, and one which is based in that awkward between of the space where we all find ourselves, which itself can sometimes be quite threatening. This is the task, it seems to be, not of the state, but of civil society, which needs to take responsibility for promoting and managing the funds of what's sometimes called social capital, which all faith communities possess. We do have ways of getting on with each other. Can we not share those more widely? That's the point. Precisely by keeping alive ultimate questions about the nature of humanity and the good life, faith communities act counter to the secular received wisdom about the intrinsic divisiveness of religion, as well as challenging the power of the market and the state. In other words, getting on with each other can be an extraordinarily important witness to wider society. And that's what builds up a truly civil society. Thirdly, finally, a word about traditional practices of hospitality. While I'm sure there are all sorts of national and international initiatives which local groups can learn from the wisdom of practice, we might talk about some of those in a moment, civil society begins in particular contexts and with the people who, quote, walk the city. Walk the city. I put that phrase in little scare quotes like that because I take it to be symbolic of the mindset of the border crosser, the person who is at home, not just in a particular place, but in the work of exploration of the wider public space, this between that I'm talking about. I don't doubt that to do that is difficult, it's time-consuming. There's no easy way of solving the myriad social problems that any context presents. On the other hand, hospitality is what we all do. We all know what it means sometimes to be the host, responsible for giving a lead, and sometimes to be the guest, to be willing to be led. So finally, to finish, you've had my first conviction about religions as schools. My second conviction is simply this. Experience teaches me that there is such a thing as a precious virtue, which at the moment I'm simply calling interreligious temperance. Not tolerance, but temperance. The ability to look with integrity to insiders, to our own community, the people on whom we depend for our very identity as people of faith, to look with integrity to insiders and with generosity to outsiders, to the other. This is something, if we really get hold of it, it's something precious. We embody it and we can teach it to others. Thank you.
Right. Well, there is a wealth of material to go at there. And I think what I'm going to invite each of these good folks to do now is to reach for the microphone that is near them so that we've got the sound up. And I'm going to invite them to talk to each other, really. But I just wonder if it might be helpful if I just kick something off with a very simple question that occurred to me. Could you speak about Leeds and Bradford and just give an example of where faiths are actually working together for the common good in each of these cities? Just as a starter, as a kind of icebreaker starter.
I think there are numerous examples where faiths are working together. So to give you an example, it's Leeds Citizens, which is a civic grassroots organization, not London Citizens, and it was it's got over 30 faith institutions that have come together to prioritize some issues affecting Leeds, simple issues like transport, mental health, other things, and it's faith institutions and organizations working together for common good. It's the shared values of those organizations and institutions that inspires them to do something good for their city.
Thanks. And I would look to my friend at the back here who's involved in a little project we've got here called Believing in Bradford, which brings people together from a range of different backgrounds and faiths and no faith, working with the Lord Mayor's office to kind of help the civic calendar and the way that the city celebrates and mourns, whether that's a vigil for a terrorist attack or the floods or something like that, or whether it's helping us to remember the war dead in the season of remembrance. And that's a wonderful example of people sharing a passion for the city, but working together across faiths in order to bring that to birth.
Right, thank you. That was the icebreaker. So, gentlemen, what would you like to ask of each other or say to each other? I'm in your hands.
I'd like to ask a question for Carrie, just to kind of put a bit of edge into this. What winds you up about the way that Christians talk sometimes? I'm asking it because one of the things I value, and I started by talking about the way I see each other as a gift, and you mentioned that wonderful verse in the Quran which says that. But I'd love to see my own faith worked out in the church through your eyes a little bit. And that's not just in terms of, let's be all nice and say nice things about one another. But I've occasionally I've seen a mischievous kind of one or two questions about that. And I just wonder whether you'd, even if putting you on the spot, just ask you that question.
Is it mischievous being from myself or somebody else? I think it's really difficult to answer, and it's not necessarily about just Christians, but I guess if I were to broaden it out to say, people of other faiths, and how they perceive Muslims and Islamic faith, and obviously the different people see it from different perspective. The root issue is, I think, lack of knowing the other. Is what I mentioned about religious illiteracy, not knowing the other. And that's not just people not knowing Muslims, but also vice versa. So I'm going to give you two examples. One is that, it's unfortunately, I think there is a real issue that people have not been able to differentiate between Islamic faith and the criminal acts of individuals who are extremists. And as I mentioned, there are what we call Islamist extremists, but also far-right extremists. And it's like when we put ourselves together, then in us and them narrative, they are the them and we are all us, because we are all on this side. So people, when I go to churches, and there's always a question. People ask, but what are Muslims doing about these extremists? What are Muslims going to do about the persecution of other communities? And it's like, why? There are three reasons. If I give, firstly, whenever there's terrorist attack, carried out by an Islamist, it gives rise to Islamophobia. So why would Muslims bring it on themselves? Secondly, no one would, in an ideal world, would like their children to become suicide bombers or become terrorists, and as a result, losing our younger generation. There are Muslims, majority of the Muslims are under the age of 25. And thirdly, it goes against the grain of our faith, against the letter as well as the spirit of our faith. So, in terms of, there's no one in a way in our mosques and institutions will talk about, about extremism, and rather we are trying to, tackle it all the time. So that's, I think, one thing that really, something that we need to, improve via communication. Now, to give you an example of the, from the other side, is that Muslims have open days, and it's now we have Visit My Mosque and other open days where we're welcoming people of all faiths and none to come to the mosque. And just traditionally, Muslims will put out literature that they will feel that this is just about telling about their faith or informing others about their faith. But what I've heard sometimes, and when we see things from the other's eyes, that literature could potentially be seen as, trying to convert people to their faith, Or at times, let's say Muslims believe Jesus to be a prophet of God, and if you emphasize on that, then potentially you are negating others' faith, the Christian faith, who see Jesus as more than just a prophet. So it's like, and so what I'm trying to say is both ways. They're trying to learn how do others see things that might be very normal, very mundane from your perspective.
Do you want to come back at that, Toby?
Yeah. I think one of the real issues between Anglican Christians and Muslims is that we're both quite territorial in our background. I mean, Anglicans, divide the country, the world, in fact, into parishes, and so every bit has a bishop and a vicar and various things. And there's a strongly territorial element in Islam as well. And I think I constantly bump up against this in my own self and in my own tradition. And I think there's a real danger at this point that the Church of England becomes the Church of England, and becomes a place where a far-right narrative can find a home. And I really hope that that's something that we can root out in West Yorkshire together, because it's a very, very it's a very insidious virus, I think.
Sorry, Michael, do you want to say something?
Just to pick up on something you were saying, Kari, it's the perception of Islam, perception of Muslims, which you're pointing to. One of the phrases which always makes me squirm when it's used in the media, and one can understand it, it comes out of government, of course, moderate Muslims. Okay. It makes me think, well, we talk about Catholics very often as devout Catholics, and a Catholic is always a devout Catholic. A Protestant is always a staunch Protestant. Well, it's true, isn't it? That's the language which is used. And I wonder whether we're getting into the trap now, that the only good Muslim, the only proper Muslim, is a moderate Muslim, which is so wimpish. Do you share my feeling that this is not a helpful stereotype? And what would you say? What would be a more positive way of classifying a Muslim? What would you want to say of yourself?
That is a real issue, and I think that kind of narrative or rhetoric or language has come up because of I guess mainly after 9/11, but even prior to that there was conversations about that because the Muslim world is still going through a period where it's finding itself from being very territorial and being in a place where they were empires, and when you don't have empire, when you have power and you don't have power, you are in a very different place. And as a result, you have to look at within yourself, but also trying to form alliances outside yourself as well. And I think we are constantly going through that period, and we haven't got 500 years to the reform movement that took place in the Christian world, so we need to get there much sooner, and so that's one aspect. I think as a result, there are these different narratives, and also different terminology has come up. Now, this really annoys Muslims, and also it goes to show that we haven't really worked out. Because we're trying to put people into different camps, so we think that moderate Muslim, what does that mean? And how do we expect moderate Muslims to behave in a way? So are we informing as to how people of a particular faith should act and should say, and what authority do we have to say that? So that needs to be considered. I think what might be helpful in terms of, obviously we've seen the terminology that has emerged in terms of Islamist and the rest being just Muslim, because then you hear sometimes about reformist, progressive Muslims, and all of that doesn't really mean much. Now coming on to the term Islamist itself, that's again a term that's been coined by the media in a way, but trying to distinguish between Muslims, who is a Muslim, basically believes in God, believes in the Prophet, believes in the Day of Judgment. It's just a Muslim, and this concept of moderate Muslim or progressive Muslim doesn't really mean internally to Muslims.
Can I ask you another slightly more provocative question?
Yeah.
And this is another of these stereotypes, perceptions that come up time and time again. It is said of Christianity that we had a Reformation. We had an Enlightenment. We have gone through all of that, and therefore we are now reasonable Christians. And that's true. We have learnt, because we have had to reason. We have learnt the canons of Enlightenment rationality, for good or ill. And there's a big story behind all that. I hear people I would think to be moderately intelligent, sometimes very intelligent, saying, the trouble with Islam, it's never been through that. How do you respond to that?
So there's a big debate about whether Islam needs to be reformed, and because I guess we inform our judgments on the basis of what we've been through, or the experiences that we know of, or the history that we share. Now, going back to that point about Muslims being in a position where they had empires, and not having those empires, and how do you live through that experience? I think there's general understanding that something needs to happen. Not necessarily the faith needs to be reformed, but we sometimes, within our own circles, we talk about Muslims reforming themselves. Now, that's a slight technical difference in terms of the faith being reformed, or the people who practice the faith, they're reforming their ways to practice their faith and live out their experiences. We are living in an age where, effectively the IT, the internet, whatever you want to call it, the cyberspace has cut across time, boundaries, and space. As a result, all faiths having to come to terms with that. Due to the political crisis in the Muslim world, we need to come to terms with that more than anyone else because of various reasons. So, sometimes I think it becomes very depressing that people sometimes within the Muslim world are actually very easily annoyed by the terminology. So sometimes when you say the Muslims, we need to be like progressive Muslims, and immediately people say, why do we need to be progressive? There's no such thing as progressive Islam. But then you ask them, so are you saying your faith is regressive? The opposite of progressive being regressive? And then they say, no, faith isn't regressive. So it's just trying to, I think sometimes not having terminology kind of, eggs people on because they don't want to be associated with a particular tradition or, reforming Islam, etc., because of the Reformation connotation. So as a result, I think there's a lot happening, and I think unfortunately this is just only, in a way, we have a long way to go because of the political crisis that's taking place in parts of the world, that will have huge impact on how Muslims come out of that crisis. Not Islam, but how Muslims come out of that political crisis.
Did you want to respond, or can I ask a question?
No, I wanted to ask.
Go on. Yeah.
I loved the way that you spoke, Michael, about this development of people who are able to walk the boundaries, and who have the confidence to step out and to be at home in other people's spaces. I think that's a wonderful vision, and something that I think you've pioneered yourself hugely. One of the things that I think stops us often is a sense of perceiving ourselves as the victim, and that when we do that, we feel somehow that it's harder to step out, or there's more to defend. I wonder whether that's because I see a kind of a victim mentality being across the whole range of faiths and in all sorts of positions. And it just seems to me something that really militates against precisely that ability to cross boundaries and to live in that liminal space.
Yes, I don't think I've got much to say to that, except that it's obviously true that given the antagonism, which is very easy to encounter towards any type of faith in contemporary society, and I think that's the sort of thing which I'm coming up against more and more, I think. It's very easy for people of faith to withdraw into enclaves, and whether that's the result of a victim mentality or whether it's just fear or lack of confidence as much as anything else. I'm not entirely sure. So I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. I think over the years I've become more conscious of just how difficult it is to do the sort of thing which I'm proposing. And I've done it for years, and I feel at the end, I've just finished a book. This isn't an advert, okay? So you don't have to buy this thing when it arrives. But it's a sobering experience, and you get to the end of writing something. It's 100,000 words, and it goes on and on and on. And at the end of it, I say to myself, have I said anything new? Have I said anything which really sums up what I want to say? And I think that's a sobering experience when you realize that you've been apparently going round in circles. I think that is actually quite a good experience as well as a sobering experience, to know that life is very much a question of repeating over and over again the things which are your primary convictions. You've had a couple of mine tonight. I could give you lots more. But I think the key thing I would always want to get across is that the world we live in, it's a wonderful phrase that Gillian Rose uses, great Jewish philosopher that died 20 years ago, now more. Very influential, especially in Rowan Williams and Church of England. She talks about the broken middle, the middle of things, where we are, the between, as I used the phrase there, is always broken. It's always broken, and it's in need of mending. And put like that, it sounds as if there's a job to be done. We've got things to do, and we have, that's true. But underpinning that, and this is my central conviction, you have to go back to the basics of repetition of your prayer, of your liturgy, reminding yourself of where it is that you've come from. Because otherwise you don't have the energy to push things forward a little bit. So my book, for what it's worth, is a liturgy. It's a repetition of things I've done before. That doesn't mean to say, by the way, that you don't have to read it or buy it or whatever it is. You can always start with the other volumes. You'll find exactly the same message, but this one probably says it a little bit better, I hope.
Michael, thank you. I think in a moment I'm just going to come to the audience. At 8:25, I'm going to ask each of the folks here just to do a point or two of summing up very briefly. But we'll have some space there. I want to ask a question before we go out to the floor, and that is, we've got a problem with religious literacy, haven't we? Here I am in my naivety thinking that everyone studies other religions at school, and therefore everyone is equipped to go out and do the stuff when you leave school and you get on with it. It's completely naive. It's not working. Have you got any kind of comments about religious literacy and the challenges and how we might respond to that challenge.
I'd like to be a bit more optimistic. I think it may not be working as well as it could, but I think our kids coming through school are often a bit more religiously literate because there is some great teaching going on about different faiths. It's not as good as it could be, but I find often with some younger people I meet that there's a real ease about faith, which I envy because I never got that.
Okay.
But I'm not saying it's all brilliant, but I think it's maybe not all terrible.
Yep.
I think that's true, and I've just pulled out some figures. The figures I talked about earlier is Hope Not Hate have done polls, and they've said only 8% of 18 to 24 years old see Muslims extremely negatively, compared to 22% of all people aged over 50. And that partly, I think, is due to what happens now in schools. I think it's still, a lot more needs to happen, unfortunately. I think some of these divisions that we see start from school playgrounds. And we've seen some examples, I think, Bradford and Leeds, where sometimes parents don't want their children to go to a particular faith, place of worship. And that actually is those parents and those children who actually do need to go. And we need to work on that. But I think that there's hope.
Do you want to contribute?
Yes, very briefly. I think I would be fairly optimistic about religious literacy because it's an issue out there, and it's certainly getting into the whole educational system. But my point is, religious literacy is right and good as far as it goes. What I'm interested in is what I would call simply theological literacy, which I think adds an important dimension to religious literacy. Religious literacy can stop short at giving you the facts and figures. This is what Muslims do, this is what Catholics do, this is what Anglicans do, etc., etc., etc. All very interesting, all very important. But why is it that they do these things? Rowan Williams talks about the theologian's job as observing what the community does when it's at prayer and it's at its liturgy and it's doing the things which keep the community together. I think that's a very important observation. That's what the theologian does. Can we encourage young people, particularly, to have a good look at a religious community at worship, at prayer? Really engage, as we are engaging, at deep, complicated issues, and asking ourselves, why do people do this? What motivates them? That's theological literacy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, let's go to the floor. We've got about 10 minutes or so. And Phil's got the microphone, and there's a hand on the front row here. And a hand at the back as well. If the hand at the back can stay up, that'd be great. And one over here as well. Yes, sir.
I applaud of almost everything you've said. How do I deal with my Christian friends who say, unless you believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, you are damned to hell?
Who wants that one?
Well, I'd say, that's a very interesting observation. Let's talk about it. And what do you mean precisely by that? The more difficult questions to answer are always those which come straight out of the Bible, where you actually have a quotation. I mean, John 14:6 is the classic one. A friend of mine said he always wanted to found a John 14:6 society. Nobody comes to me except, nobody comes to the Father except through me. Can't even get it right myself. That's a difficult one to handle. I personally don't have any difficulty in talking about Christ as the center of my universe, or indeed the center of the universe. My problem is always trying to convince people that one doesn't have to be totally caught up into one and only one comprehensive view of things, which is centered around a key belief or a key symbol, such as the person of Christ. Okay, one doesn't have to make that a totally exclusive paradigm into which nobody else can somehow fit. And that's always the question. How can I, as a responsible Christian, okay, so present my faith that I leave theological space for God to be God and therefore for other people to be other? That's the challenge.
Great. Thank you, Phil. The gentleman there at the back, and then the lady over there, behind you, Phil.
Yeah, Bishop Toby and honoured guests, thank you. My name's John from St Margaret's, Ilkley. I just wanted to make the point that when I was at school, of course, we just got the Christian religion. There wasn't much in the way of other religions taught in my school. As an adult, in fact, as indeed someone who's retired now, I've got quite a number of Muslim friends, and I've been out, I've had meals, we've walked together, we've talked about God together, we've learned things from each other, and I see a lot in the Quran which I find quite helpful. Now, this is because I belong to a faith, and so does particularly one Muslim friend. Now, it's a question of the secular world, I think, where we need to consider how do we move forward, because a lot of this negativity in the press, I feel, is from the secular world. That's where we need to be thinking about, I think.
Thank you. A response from the gentleman there?
In a sense, I agree with you, or I can see where you're coming from. Although I think one of the things I've learned from Bradford is just how diverse all of our worlds and communities are. Whether that's Christian communities or Muslim communities or Jewish communities or communities of no faith. And I think it's a bit of a temptation to get together with a common enemy. That there can be elements of that, but I think that can also be unhelpful. And I think of the one time really when all the religious communities in Jerusalem get together and aren't at each other's throats, and that's to oppose the Pride March. And actually that's not all the communities, but it's when you see a lot of the faith leaders together. And I think that is, for me, deeply unhelpful when we can have a common unity, I mean, against a common enemy. I know that's not what you're saying, but I find sometimes that the people I find most common cause with are actually from another faith, sometimes even when I'm thinking about people of my own faith who I disagree with. So it's a very complex picture. Yeah.
Do you want to make a contribution, Gary? Or don't have to.
Yeah. I think I'll echo what Bishop Toby just said. Effectively, I mean, when we put people into camps, whether it's like people of all faiths and then say people of no faith or people of one particular faith against the other faith, is because of us. Our judgments are informed of what we know of them. So effectively, when we talk about secularists or militant secularists, it's because they see faiths from a particular lens. And it's trying to reach out to people, saying about how can we agree on shared values, and how can we agree on some of the projects that we have in our neighborhoods. And you'll see actually, we've done some of that work in Leeds, that actually whether you are of a particular faith or no faith, people do share values, and they can come together on values. And then it's knowing the other helps remove some of the barriers that we sometimes come across.
Thank you. Lady at the back.
Michael mentioned Gillian Rose as the Jewish theologian. I'm very interested in hearing about other female theologians or women leaders in the context of this interfaith dialogue.
Right.
Off the top of my head, two of my favourite theologians are both women and both Jewish. Simone Weil, who I think is one of the greatest philosophers of the last century, an amazing young woman whose thoughts just stop you. I can't really think of one off the top of my head which would illustrate my point, but she does write with that sort of aphoristic clarity, which is there to stop you and make you think. Somebody who is deeply haunted by the presence of God, and also, I think, deeply respectful of the sources of wisdom that she's gained from other religions. Jewish, certainly by birth, always battling against her own Jewishness, never became a Catholic, never wanted to be baptized, never wanted to belong in a way. She's a terrible challenge to us in all sorts of ways, which is why I keep coming back to her time and time again. She is one figure, and the other one is another Jewish philosopher, really, rather than a theologian, though she became more of a theologian in her later life, and that's Edith Stein, who, of course, was murdered in Auschwitz, 1943, who I think is one of the most extraordinary thinkers, who I think, as well as being a martyr for her own Jewishness, which I think she rediscovered, ironically, as she became a Catholic. She became a nun, of course. But there's somebody there who more and more people are beginning to appreciate as a philosopher, as somebody who spent an incredible amount of time and energy really getting to grips with the phenomenological tradition of the early part of last century, and wrote some really rather important works on that. I don't know enough about her to be able to talk at any great length, as you can tell, but I am impressed by the way in which her texts are now becoming more and more familiar, and they are being read, giving her position, her rightful position as a critical philosopher, and not just as the nun who went to Auschwitz and was put to death because she happened to be of Jewish birth. You know. So those two figures I would very much commend, both as women coming from the Jewish tradition, as martyrs in their own way, certainly as witnesses, but of people of profound thought about the presence of God in the world. And they've certainly been an inspiration to me.
Thank you. Any additions, or shall we move to... Yes, thank you. One last question, I think it's going to have to be. I think Phil down here. Thank you.
I'd quite like to pick up on the point that you made just before you opened for questions. As someone who is in school and studies religious studies, I still feel very illiterate in theological or religious literacy. How can I make myself more theologically literate?
That's a great question to finish. Okay, 3 specialists.
At the end of every meeting, I have always discovered that somebody bowls you the googly, to give you the cricketing metaphor, and the one that just completely flummoxes you. It's a very good question. I'm tempted just to repeat myself and say, well, keep going back over the key texts. I'm a great believer in scripture study. That's where I started in theology, and I have learnt more and more that if you keep going back to the texts, reading a good set of commentaries, and above all else, not trying to isolate one text or one book or one commentator on its own so that you become the expert in Matthew or Hebrews or whatever it is. I have learned that the best thing to do is to try and follow up where some of these texts have actually come from. The stuff which I've been writing about recently has been first century Christianity. Long way from interreligious relations you would think, but actually it's in the separation of Christianity from Judaism that I think we Christians learn so much about who we are. So that's a little area that you might want to consider, because there is an amazing amount of stuff now being written about how on earth Christians discovered their own identity and sense of difference from Judaism. That's a difficult area to get into, because it raises the whole question of Jewish-Christian relations and how Christians think of Jews and how Jews think of Christians. Are we the same? No. Are we different? No. So how do we talk about ourselves?
Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to add anything, gentlemen?
I think I'll just add on to that even when you, I guess, read scriptures and books or textbooks, there'll always be somebody who, of a different faith acting very differently. And therefore, it's as well as studying text, it's like being in the company of people and getting to know people, which is, I think, is more about community cohesion, social cohesion, rather than religious literacy. So I didn't want to take away that not religious literacy and theological literacy, but also getting to know the other will be a huge asset to your understanding.
Yes, and I think that's what I would say too. Particularly for me, it's been a matter of praying for one special friend who I can really get to know well. The first guy I met, he was a South African imam. We had a deal that he would teach me Arabic and I would teach him to swim. And I almost drowned trying to do Arabic verbs while swimming. But it was getting to the point where we got to know each other and then started asking question, and finally actually wondering whether we could pray together. Him asking me, so what do you pray for me, Toby? And me having to answer that really honestly, getting really below the surface over a period of time. And I think that's a gift, and I would commend it to you, because to me, it comes to the heart of it. I think it goes back to what Michael said. Actually, it's in the particularity of one friendship that we actually learn the art of living in that space and being comfortable in that space, which then applies across the piece. But it's going deep in the one that helps us to do that.
Thank you, Toby. I just re-endorse that as well. My first experience of engagement with an imam was just totally memorable to me. He come to the church where I was vicar, and we sat down, and he looked at me and he said, "Okay, so you believe in the Trinity? How does it work?" And something inside me was both terrified by the question, as you'd imagine, but also I thought, yes, this is brilliant, because he doesn't want to know about the monuments in this place. He doesn't want to know about the triple-decker pulpit. He actually wants to know about what I believe. And I think for me that was what it was about. I'm going to ask these good folk, if there's one point that you would like to leave with us to think about, could you tell us what that one point might be, briefly, because we've got to come to a conclusion. Who wants to go first?
I've got the microphone. I've got several points. But, one point would be this. We've avoided this word all through the evening. We've used the word conversation, which I think is a wonderful word because, in fact, it was the title of my first book, religions in conversation. Conversation, because I made a big thing of it there, that it's the informal conversation which is so important. Getting to know somebody and being able to let things develop in their own way. A conversation is informal, whereas the word which I want to just throw into the mix is dialogue, okay, which tends to be used as a rather technical term, mainly because I think it has a number of different meanings, and it certainly has a number of different connotations. I would just want to leave you with this, that the Catholic wisdom, insofar as there is any, which sets around dialogue, recognizes 4 different types of dialogue: theological exchange, religious experience, common life, and common action. I'm always agonizing over how those 4 fit together. Theological exchange, experts; religious experience, when you move into the spiritual underpinnings of a faith; common life, common action. They more or less speak for themselves. But the interesting thing is that over the years, I've noticed a big shift from dialogue. It used to be what theologians did. Dialogue is now what we all do, living together as good neighbors and learning how to do that, and learning how to reflect seriously upon what we observe each other doing as conversation partners. Perhaps that's enough of a thought.
Thank you, Michael. Gary.
I'll say the same thing, but perhaps in different ways. That I was going to use the word being comfortable in your own selves, but also making others comfortable around you. I talked about that. I think there tends to be this sense of insecurity, and that sometimes insecurity, perhaps maybe euphemism, fear, apprehension, and that really then we go into enclaves. We become afraid of the other. But if we are comfortable in our own selves and making others comfortable around us, then that will give us the comfort to have that conversation, to have that dialogue, and to reach out to the other.
I think that's great, yeah, because I think that's what our city needs. It needs that confidence. It needs people who are willing to be able to say why they're doing what they're doing and not just do it, and actually to be able to speak from the depths of their own theology. But it's really hard to do when you're frightened to stand on a platform next to the train coming in because you think somebody's going to push you in front of the train, which is what a number of my Muslim sisters feel. And so let's not forget that level of it and those things that break it down. But I guess my final real thought is what a brilliant place Bradford is for doing that, and Leeds to an extent, but possibly even London. But but it's great that this conversation could happen here in Bradford Cathedral.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. My hope and prayer actually is that this is a beginning. What we've done tonight is a beginning. And I'd like to see more and more of this kind of public exchange. Cathedrals, historically, have been places where the community gathers for important conversation, where it is home to people of faith and faiths. And I certainly feel that for this city. So on your behalf, would you please express your deep thanks to Michael Barnes, Carrie Assim, Bishop Toby. Thank you so much for coming. We are finished for the evening. Thank you.